I'm no, there we go. I'm Ashley from the Working Class Climate Alliance, and I want to welcome you to the second panel discussion from our two-part series, Who's Afraid of the Working Class, which is centered around the failure of many leftist movements to include working class people in discussions and decision-making processes. Despite the fact that the working class are integral to building a mass movement capable of progressive transformation, and that it is vital to center class in everything that we do, including paying attention to working class perspectives, it continues to be disregarded by large sections of various leftist movements. This has weakened the overall strength of progressive movements and produced spaces that are inherently undemocratic and classist in scope. Additionally, large sections of the left continue to be dominated by society's more privileged voices, notably those who are white, middle class, academically educated, and from the global north. But how are the working class themselves resisting this and mobilizing for progressive change amongst themselves? And how can the left cater better to and support voices who sit outside of the white, middle class, and global north demographic? We've invited some speakers here today to answer these questions from their perspectives. Sadly, Antonio isn't able to join us this evening, but we are joined by Andya Paz, Iris Duane, and Niall Christie. Niall Christie is a trade unionist and socialist activist from Dundee, now based in Glasgow. He ran as a Scottish Green Party candidate in the 2024 general election, contesting the Glasgow South seat and achieving the party's best ever result at a Westminster election. He has worked as a journalist for local, national, and specialist publications in Scotland and across Britain. Then we have Iris Duane, as a working class socialist and feminist activist hailing from the north of England, now based in Glasgow. Having achieved the second best result for the Scottish Green Party at a Westminster election, standing for the Glasgow North seat, Iris now sits as the Vice President for Student at the Glasgow University Student Representative Council. As a student in politics and social policy, she was named by Young Women Scotland on the 30 under 30 list. And then finally, we have Andya Paz, a decolonial scholar and PhD candidate in environmental sciences and policy at Central European University. Her work focuses on the intersection of climate change and coloniality, particularly on ways of understanding climate catastrophes and recovery. She seeks to cultivate a space where the lived experiences and situated knowledge of grassroots communities can be articulated and advanced, not only to challenge the Western hegemony and often top-down articulation of climate crises, but also to promote an intervention grounded in the realities of those most affected. In the long run, she aims to contribute to decolonial climate justice. So each speaker today will go for about 10 to 12 minutes each, and then we'll take questions from people for the panel speakers. If you could write your questions in the chat as and when they arise, there's no need to wait until the end to send them. We'll keep an eye on the chat throughout the talk, and then I'll read them out to the speakers to answer after everyone has spoken. So maybe, Niall, shall we start with you, if that's all right? And you have 10 to 12 minutes to go.
Sure thing. Thanks, Ashley. And thanks to the Working Class Climate Alliance for inviting me along. As Ashley said, my name's Niall Christie. I'm a journalist, I'm an activist, and I'm a socialist. And I'm originally from Dundee. I think the first place to start is who am I? And I think the biggest thing to say is that, I'm working class to the core. I think as a failed politician, I think the key thing I think I meant to say now that I'm the son of a factory worker or a teacher or a community educator, and I suppose all those things are true, but I think more importantly, trying to ground yourself in your own class is a very important thing, particularly if you're going to run for electoral office, which I did fairly recently. It's only been a few weeks and it feels like forever ago now, but I think there are opportunities arising even from what effectively was a loss, even though it was a fairly good one by Green standards in Scotland. But I do think that class politics, class awareness, and particularly around environmental issues, is important. And I think I've kind of come to that realization over a long period of time. So I'm not suggesting that forcing that down the throats of the electorate is a good plan short term, but I do think that pushing people in the right direction is something we can do and something we should do over the next few years. And I think that that'll become more and more obvious as the climate continues to change and worsen over the coming years. But I do think that people will still need a push in the right direction. So a bit about me. I'm a journalist. I started work as a local journalist covering a fairly impoverished area just outside of Glasgow called Barrhead. It's one of the poorest areas in Scotland, and I was the only journalist covering that area for the local newspaper. I think local press is very important, and if I get too bogged down in the media side of this, feel free to kind of stop me at any point. But I do think that my first job in journalism was possibly the most important one. I think that the perception in local press, and not many people know, is that it's not as important as national press, particularly around politics, particularly around the environment and that kind of thing. But when it comes to the environment, more people will get environmental stories from the local press than they will the national press. And that's partly because things like changes to the weather, local flooding, uh, green belt, brown belt, house building, all of these issues are much more likely to be covered by local reporters who are on the ground and centred in communities. I think that that's important for a number of reasons. One, because these communities largely, when it comes to national interest, are kind of forgotten. I saw that I went on to work for larger local newspapers in Glasgow, and then I was the Scotland editor of the socialist daily newspaper, the Morning Star, for a few years. I did see in those jobs, though, that it's very easy to forget communities that particularly are going to struggle. Sorry, I think somebody said something there.
No, I was just saying that the recording is in progress. Don't worry.
Fabulous, thanks. So I went on to work for daily and national newspaper titles, and you can see how quickly working class communities and forgotten communities just fall by the wayside when it comes to coverage. And that's largely because I work in a profession where the middle class and the upper class dominate. That's particularly true when it comes to more larger newspapers, larger online outlets. When it comes to the commentariat, most of those are middle class and upper class people. Working class journalists tend to, in my experience, cover the local communities that they grew up in. They will try and be a little bit more creative about what outlets they can work with, and a lot of them will work in freelance, which, as we all know, is very unpredictable. And that's kind of where I found myself for a lot of my career, trying to cover communities that are there. I'm now in a position where I work in a nice magazine that allows me to do political activism on the side. So a lot of the energies I put into previously working and covering local issues and community-based issues, I now focus on with the Scottish Greens and the Glasgow Greens in particular, and that kind of led me into politics. I want to kind of cover why I chose the Green Party, because I'm from Dundee, I'm from a housing scheme. The Greens are not the party of traditionally the party of the working class in Scotland. That would be largely the Labour Party, and then post independence referendum, that would have been the SNP. So I suppose that my natural home should really be with one of those two. And I think that most people on the left in Scotland still find themselves voting for one of those two parties, despite the fact that they aren't particularly progressive. They don't really centre themselves in working class communities. By and large, most of their politicians are middle class, have academic backgrounds, and will mostly still focus their energies on political issues that favour the upper and wealthy class. So why would I choose the Greens? I think it's quite simple. If you look at the policies, they are fairly well grounded in working for people who don't really have a voice. And I do understand that there can be an element of white saviourness to that. There can be an element of people speaking for others who don't have a voice, and quite often that can lead to them continuing not to have one. But I think there has been some excellent work being done in the last few years, particularly by the Scottish Greens, and by and large in Glasgow, we have really, really worked hard to get past that idea that we are middle class vegans who just care about the climate and nothing else. I think that a linked up approach to how we approach social justice and climate justice is something that we have done particularly well. And I think that contrasts very strongly with particularly the SNP and the Labour Party. For anyone who knows UK politics, I'm discounting the Tories for good reason, but Labour and the SNP still do have some very, very credible working class communities in them. The Labour Party are affiliated to trade unions, for example. The SNP and their successes largely have been borne out in the last few years of the independence referendum in Scotland, which, was a vote that brought in more working class communities than ever before. And I think that can't be discounted. But I think that having spent a lot of time covering the Labour Party, particularly for the Morning Star, particularly around the time towards the end of the Jeremy Corbyn premiership and towards the for the first couple of years of Keir Starmer's leadership, you really do see that there has been a move away from not just working class communities in the UK, but also that internationalist outlook that potentially was on offer in 2019 under what could have been a Labour government and sadly wasn't. I think that we are now in a position where we have had a government for 14 years who have been fairly isolationist. I think that we really risk a situation where we have a UK government again that continues to fund richer, better off communities, largely in low populated areas outside of cities, in an attempt to try and shore up votes at the expense of good policy and also long-term thinking. And I think when it comes to the climate, long-term thinking is the only thing that matters, because realistically, we need to try and invest now, or there's not going to be a planet to live on. I think looking forward, I said to a couple of people before I came on the call that I apologize in advance if there's any crying in the background. I've got a 4.5-month-old son. His name's Noah. He's in the next room through there watching the TV with his mum. One of the reasons I ran in the election when I had a very, very young son, it would have been very, very easy for me not to run. And I think that one of the overwhelming drives for me to do so was him. I think anyone who has a stake in the future, and that isn't just anyone with kids, that's anyone who cares about the planet, that's anyone who has thought about what world they want to leave for the next generation. I think it's fairly obvious that action needs to be taken now. And I think that, inequality particularly, and I mean that both on a local level in Glasgow, on a national and international level, both in Scotland and abroad, inequality is massively on the rise. But I think there is one small positive there, in that I think inequality is rising. That isn't a good thing. To be very clear, that is a very bad thing, and we should fight against it. But what we will see is, and not to get into a Marxist definition of what a working class is, but we are seeing more and more people who would have previously been quite comfortable, would have been upper middle class, are now struggling every single month to pay their bills, can't pay their mortgage, and are struggling to put food on the table. And I think that there are opportunities there to radicalize people in what could possibly be quite a good way. You can organize what would have been fairly complacent political minds previously are now seeing the real pressures that are put on working class people every day. And I think there is an opportunity there to see what is more of a wider working class. And by that I mean anyone who has to work for a living. They are not, living off of the interest or have massive amounts of property, in Britain in particular, but also in other parts of the Western world. We have rising inequality, and I think that there is an opportunity for people like myself, Iris, who also ran for the Greens in Glasgow, and other politicians who are minded to do so, to point out that, yes, absolutely, like financial inequality at the moment is massively hurting us, but in 20, 30, 50 years' time, climate inequality is going to come around at the same rate. To look at Glasgow, for example, or Greater Glasgow, there's about 1.8 million people live in Glasgow and the surrounding area. Of those communities, you're going to see massive rises in, sea levels. That'll massively impact the River Clyde. A lot of the communities that are just on the Clyde include Govan, they include Renfrew and Erskine, they go all the way up to Greenock, back down Dumbarton, Clydebank, and all the way into Lanarkshire. For anyone who doesn't know Scotland, all of those are very, very impoverished areas, traditionally working class areas, and they're going to be disproportionately hit by this. And I think that that is a case that we can and should make over the next few years. That was quite grim, and I'm going to try and, if I can, try and pull to what is more of an opportunity. So to look at the Glasgow South campaign that I was in, for what it's worth, the Scottish Greens have traditionally not done particularly well at general elections, and somewhere between 12 and 13% is a good result. Iris and I actually have the two best results for Scottish Green candidates anywhere in Scotland ever, which is fabulous. And I think that one of the reasons we both did really well, not to step on Iris's toes here, she'll correct me if I'm wrong, but we did focus on non-traditional votes. I stood in an area, Glasgow South, where there is a large professional population, fairly leafy, lots and lots of flats. Absolutely, we did really well there. But we also went to the housing schemes that are on the edge of Glasgow that traditionally would be forgotten. Greens would never have ever gone to those schemes in previous years. And I think that one of the reasons our vote went up by quite so much in this election is because we went to forgotten areas that previously were just untouched. And actually, we were going to doors and people were, they had never seen a politician before of any colour, regardless of whether it was us or someone else. And it was great to see. And I think that it's working out where those working classes are now, because they aren't just in housing schemes, they are in, fairly leafy areas, and they can't pay their rent, but they've been stuck in that area for their entire life. They don't want to leave their community behind. And I think that there are opportunities there. And to look at a positive, I think in Glasgow particularly, and I know there are other Glasgow Greens on the call. Thanks very much for the support tonight. It's really fantastic because I'm very nervous to be speaking here. But we are looking at a kind of non-traditional canvassing and kind of campaigning model. We are doing work that would probably more be traditionally called community organising across Glasgow. So it's really good to see an opportunity taken, not just in this part of Glasgow, but other parts as well. That isn't to say there aren't challenges. We've already seen missed opportunities, particularly in Glasgow. I covered COP26 in this very city, which was a massive missed opportunity, which was essentially just a talking shop for the upper class, while the working classes marched on the street outside, were locked out, and maybe had a few fringes here and there. Not to say that that was invaluable. It really was, and the international solidarity that came out of COP is one of the most inspiring things I've ever seen in my life, and I think possibly will ever see. But it didn't really bring about anything that we actually need. So to finish off, I think it's quite clear that we need, change here. There's a misconception from that people who are poor or working class don't care about the climate because they maybe have more kind of pressing issues, but that's simply not the case in my opinion. I've been chapping doors for months, if not years, and we know that working class people in ordinary parts of Glasgow and beyond care about the climate and they want to see something happen here. People might fear paying a bit more taxes, but when you explain to them it's not the pennies from the poorest we need, it's cracking open the massive cash cow of the uber wealthy. There is a huge opportunity there. So I think two things: we need money and we need bold action. The first can really only come with the right politicians and some education, and I think that's one of the reasons that the kind of political and more parliamentary part of organising comes about. But also we need empowerment in communities. And I think that we are fairly unique in the Scottish Greens that we want to try and centre ourselves in those communities. And we've done so with local councillors who've been doing fantastic work. We've done that with lead activists who have been in communities for the last few years, and we'll continue to build on that. So I think I've probably talked for long enough, and I'm quite happy to hand over. But if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them, and I'm sure Iris will kind of continue to build on what I've said. So thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Niall. And yes, I see that we already have a few questions coming up in the chat, and I encourage you to continue to put
these people are
questions there, and we'll bring them back at the end, or I'll put them to the speakers at the end. And for now, I think I think each speaker can take 1 or 2 extra minutes, since we are missing one of the speakers that was planned for today. So Niall, don't worry, you are fine for time. But I think now we will move on to Iris, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to speak to people. I'll just go ahead and apologize first. I don't often speak for 10 to 12 minutes. If I get quite muddled in the middle, just go with it. As Niall has already said, we're both activists in the Scottish Green Party, specifically in the Glasgow Green Party, and we achieved the 2 best results in Westminster for the Scottish Greens that we've ever achieved. This was, like he said, by speaking to non-traditional voters, by going out there and showing people that actually, the left is working class, and that there are certain images or predominant factions of the left that may be portrayed as being very middle class based, which often they are, but it does not define the struggle for a better world. Outside of that, I also, like has already been mentioned, I'm the Vice President for Student Support at the Glasgow University Student Representative Council, and I'm also just an activist in general outside of my work with the Scottish Green Party, and I have been for many years. I also consider myself a non-traditional activist. I'm what they tell you to be afraid about in Parliament. I am the tofu eating wokarati. Apparently so, despite the fact that I'm also the working class girl from a mill village, a rural mill village in Northern England, where obviously people like myself could never exist. That's Tory heartlands, apparently, according to them. As we've already mentioned here, the leftist movements and climate movements often are dominated by middle class voices who are speaking what I would say is middle class language, who are considering activism through the lens of what it means to be a middle class activist. In doing so, this has had a massive knock-on effect, in my opinion at least, on the climate struggle as a whole. As we all stand here today as climate activists, as people who are concerned about the future, as those of us who want to see a fairer Britain, well, not just Britain, across the world, my apologies, we all have these massive ideas of what can we do, what can be fixed. But by having movements that are so dominated by the middle class, in my opinion, we've seen is issues such as the climate have been seeded by the neoliberal consensus, so the Tory and the Labour Party here in Britain and across the world in separate political parties, where they have pushed this narrative that in order to fix the climate, then the working class have to pay, turning them away from this joint struggle that we have together and moving them towards the idea that things such as net zero, such as having low emission zones, such as making sure that commercial flights, especially for the very rich, are controlled properly, such as taxing oil barons fairly, such as doing all these things that cause us to have a greener, brighter world, are predominantly going to hurt the working class. Now, it doesn't have to be like that. It never had to be like that. These are political choices that are being made by the very people in power to disproportionately affect the working class, as many political choices are made. But it's framed as an inevitability that if we put windfall taxes on big oil companies that are refusing to transition away from oil and gas, that this will hurt your bills, that if we transition out gas and oil in the North Sea here in Scotland, but obviously in other places around the world, that this will take jobs away, that if we put low emission zones into our key urban areas, that you will no longer be able to drive. And as we know, motorists are the true voice of the working class here in Britain. It's all a joke, to be honest. It really is a joke. But this, as much as it is a failure of the neoliberal consensus, is also a failure of the left to combat this by allowing these movements to be predominantly driven. Now, I'm saying allowing in a very liberal term here. Trust me, it's not often allowed in many spaces. But these people who do come in, often with formal education, so with degrees and stuff, whilst they do care for uplifting the working class, whilst they do care for fighting against the climate crisis, for some of them, they've learned to care about this. They've seen the numbers and they've felt that that is an injustice. Now, that's fantastic. We need people like that. These movements thrive over people like that. But for people like me, I didn't learn to care. I had to care. This was my life. I went without meals. I couldn't afford public transport. I had to work 2 jobs when I was in college just to get back and to the college that I was working 2 jobs to get to. And in doing this, these movements become what appears to be inaccessible. We watch, for like I said, I mean, I'm victim of it myself. I describe myself as a non-traditional activist at the beginning of this speech. That's not true. I'm just your traditional activist. I'm everything that politics comes from. I'm raised how I've been raised. I've gained all of this experience across my entire life, and I take that and I want to put that to make my communities better. But we're made to feel as though if you don't have a specific degree, if you don't speak a specific language, if you possibly don't have the time to give up, that many activist circles require you to give up, then you are not a true activist. For the left, in my opinion, to open it wider up to the climate, we need to make sure that we reframe what an activism truly means. When people, especially here in Britain, now I will speak mainly about Britain today, as that's where my expertise lies, we're seeing inequality go up. We're seeing more children going into poverty. We're seeing the climate crisis getting worse, and we're seeing often little help coming from the state. We know from Maslow's hierarchy of needs that you have to care for the very bottom before you can move to the top. For many of these people, whilst they are concerned about the climate, they're concerned about fighting for a better future, they're making sure that they have four walls and a roof around them, and that they're getting at least one meal a day, which for many families in Britain is now a privilege. They don't often have time to come into these spaces, to have to fight to be heard against a language that is often being portrayed as much more complex than it actually is, to be told that they need to read their theory instead of knowing what is best for their communities, and to go around and fight in a movement that often isn't nearly as welcoming as it should be. What we need to do is to reject this consensus, this idea that the working class are being forced into certain political movements, and that anyone else who thinks about the small things such as flooding, increasing prices for healthcare, increasing dependence on oil and gas, which is getting steeper and steeper, and our biodiversity crisis, of course, the little things, is middle class. We need to be reframing these arguments instead of telling, of course, they're very important. But often, I've found, in my experience at least, these big movements that, as we've already mentioned, are dominated by middle-class people, often fail to speak about what this actually means for everyone. Just saying the planet is burning isn't enough. The planet is burning and your bills are going to go up. The planet is burning and this is the reason why the government is saying they don't have any money. The planet is burning. The government have told you they've got no money for it now. Can you imagine what that means in 25 years? As we're becoming here on the planet to our final deadline to mitigate this climate crisis, we are being told again and again and again by the neoliberal consensus that we can't afford it. And we as a left, over time, have, to an extent, failed to combat it. Now, I say that as a left, as this very vague, big idea. This is not to invalidate the fantastic work that is gone in by many, many activists here in Britain and across the world. As Niall has already mentioned, the activist groundwork here in Glasgow continues to rise, and we, as a political force powered by the people, is going up and up and up. So that's one thing. But time is now, we've got very little left. Together, we need to be showing as a joint force, no longer our inner bickering about what language we should use here or what papers we should read there, but real, solid policy proposals to put forward to the world. What we saw in the UK general election, for those of you who may not be in the United Kingdom, that happened recently, is a Labour Party supposedly representing the working class, getting the lowest ever working class voters they'd ever got, on the lowest ever turnout we've had since universal suffrage, with ultimately, I believe, if I remember correctly, 16.7% of all eligible voters in the UK, so that includes people that didn't vote, voted for the Labour Party, handing them over 2/3 of the House. This wasn't an inevitability. Many people vote in cultural ways. What we saw in smaller areas is we saw independent candidates breaking through. More independent candidates becoming members of parliament than ever before since 1960. This shows there is appetite for difference. There's appetite for care. There is appetite for change. It just needs to be placed in the right ways. So this requires compromise as a left. It requires us to get out there and meet people where they're at. Not go to them and dictate to them how they should think or speak or feel, but as they are, tell them why we're concerned and bring them along with us. As Niall said, in this general election, we targeted non-traditional areas. Now, targeted sounds like quite an active word, but it was more of, at least for me, and I'm not sure if Niall felt the same, just thinking, these people have never had anyone speak to them before. These people are like me. Oftentimes I would speak to people on doors and they would be like, wow, I've learned more today than I have in the last 10 years about what the Green Party stands for. I would sit at hustings with hundreds of people in the crowd and they would come to me afterwards and say, this is more informative than we've seen on TV. You want real change. You're not lying to us. You're giving the numbers. You're telling us that some will need to make sacrifices and others won't. So it's about being honest. It's about, like I said, bringing people with us, not just in electoral politics. That's just one avenue to change, but in all politics. The climate is political. and it's being ripped away from us. Whilst as a movement, the middle class, very academicized, if that's a word, segment of the left, is currently quabbling in itself on what messaging works best. It's truly now the last hour. We've had years upon years upon years. Now, I'm proud that the working class voice is now growing in these movements, as it needs to be. But that will only work if we do it together, openly and transparently. I believe that's all I have to say right now. I have spoken for just under 12 minutes. I didn't see I'd do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Iris. Great for time as well. All right, then. And again, I see more questions coming into the chat. Feel free to continue to do so. And now we'll go on to our final speaker for the evening, which is Andya.
Yeah, hi everyone. And and thank you, Iris, for that very nice talk. And I'd like to say first that I do agree with you when you said that the climate is political. There are, for example, studies about the greenhouse gas emission, specifically by Jason Hickel in the global north, was found responsible for the cumulative greenhouse gas emission price of 92%, as opposed to the global south, which reap the burdens of climate change that has only 8% greenhouse gas emissions since the 1800s. So anywho, my name is Andya Paz. I am a decolonial scholar and a PhD candidate in environmental sciences from the Central European University. And I am also here to represent the South-South movement, and I am one of its co-organizers. And the South-South movement, just to give a brief background, is an autonomous collective that is claiming a space for academics and activists from and for the global South. And my work is about, I am working on climate crisis or climate catastrophe, specifically in the areas of epistemes or knowledge making. And this includes how, for example, climate change, climate crisis, or climate disasters are articulated in the discourse, who is articulating them, what counts as valid knowledges, and what is considered as telltales, for example. And climate catastrophes are also say presented in the broader discourse as if it belongs to some distant future, the way we talk about mitigation, for example, or endless climate negotiations in COP. However, in some regions of this world, and this is not often taken into account, in some regions of this world, I would say that these catastrophes have already fallen, and people, or multi-species communities rather, are already living in its conditions and are trying to sustain life on a day-to-day basis. And Typhoon Haiyan, I would say, typhoon that happened way back in 2013 is a good example of this. And this is also a good example of how the unequal contribution of greenhouse gas contribution can contribute to the disasters that is happening in the far-flung areas of this world. So Typhoon Haiyan is actually the strongest typhoon recorded so far, and it is being considered as a new category of storms, category 6 that is. And it does not only spark conversations on loss and damages during the 2013 COP, 19th Conference of the Parties in Warsaw, Poland, but Typhoon Haiyan also highlights, for example, the continuities of climate catastrophes as opposed to the usual presentation or framing of disasters as singular events that happen in one moment in time and are transitory. But it goes on and on and on. And actually, I would contend that Typhoon Haiyan, something that happened more than 10 years ago, is still ongoing up until now, as is, for example, apparent with the lives of the people who are still displaced from their dwellings and have been dispossessed. And that includes the working classes and those that are plagued with unemployment in that regions of the world. So what I'm trying to say here is that the knowledge making or the articulation of disasters has some certain ramification. Normally, in disasters of discourses with disasters, they are framed within Western epistemologies. Actually, there's a research by J.C. Gaylor found that the articulation of disasters in that journal since the 1977 disaster journal, since 1977, approximately 84% of the authors came from Western institutions, and they are articulating disasters that happened outside the West. And they're using epistemologies and knowledges that may not actually translate to the actual conditions outside the Western boundaries. And this articulation creates this epistemic disjuncture that has material consequences to those living with it, especially when imposed in policy, for example, or adopted in education system, translated into research, etc. Etc. Yeah, and I would say that this material ramification that stems from epistemic disjuncture also cut across classes, for instance, as well as gender and racial hierarchies, and it also erases other ways of knowing that should be at the forefront of the discourse, how we can actually articulate climate realities based on our lived and situated experiences, for instance, without being homogenized, without being erased by the dominant paradigms and frameworks that articulates it. Yeah, and I would like to extend this by saying that this kind of erasure of epistemes or being omitted in a discourse is in a way a form of slow violence. That is a form of violence that is so small, according to Rob Nixon, that it doesn't count as violence at all. So it could be like it's one thing, for example, for a group of people to be subjected to a storm or the impact of a storm in one moment of their lives. And it's another thing for a group of people to be subjected to repetitive storms in their everyday life. And it is counted that repetitive subjection and that framing of storms as natural as opposed to something that is political, because decisions have been made before the storms and after the storms. It comes to recovery, preparation, emergency, and everything that is count certain lives, prioritizes others. And that I would say is a form of slow violence in its own way. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you, Andya. All right then. So with all the speakers finished, I think now we'll move on to questions. There are a few in the chat that are that everyone can see, and a few that have been sent directly to me as well. So I think for now, I'd suggest, or I propose, that we circle back to start with some that are directly for Niall, and we'll kind of go in order from that, if that's all right. And so Niall, to start with, for you, we have from Amy, can you explain more about how and why parliamentary politics is the answer to better conditions for working class people, or more power for working class people?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I think in short, I think it's one of the answers. I don't think it's all of the answers. I think it's probably one of the smallest, to be honest. I think from my experience as someone who has written about politics and also participated in, I think that politicians have quite a fairly big responsibility in reaching out to people, because they have access to entire communities at a given time. I'm not elected and wasn't elected, and but if I had been, if I was the MP for Glasgow South right now, I would be receiving hundreds and hundreds of emails a day from people with their concerns. And I think that the framing of your responses and the framing of the messaging that you put out and how you also vote can be centered in working class voices. It can put lived experience at the front of that. I think by and large, in the past, we haven't seen that. I think with some fairly notable exceptions in the UK, we haven't really seen any politicians put working class voices at the forefront of what they're doing. And I think that that's something we need to try and combat. When it comes to what can politicians do, I think the answer is fairly short. It is obviously kind of bringing about laws that can allow for the working classes to thrive. But I think, as we've seen, even just in the first 3 weeks of a Labour government, even with a cabinet that is massively more rooted in working class communities, and that's not to say that there isn't a huge amount of privilege at the top of the government at the moment, we are seeing a much more representative government now than we have done in the past under the Conservatives. What they could be doing is allowing for spaces for social movements to actually make an impact. And I think someone else has also asked the question about how we tie in climate and social movements with political parties, and I'll not kind of encroach too much on that at the moment. But it is about that kind of political window, the Overton window, as it's often called, of what is achievable at any given point. And I think that social movements often push people in the right direction, but politicians kind of often set where the kind of very hard boundaries of that are. And I think that that's what we need to see. So I think that politicians can create opportunities for social movements to drive things. I think we are seeing at the moment, for example, and this isn't a climate example, but we are seeing the UK government in particular move on their position on Gaza. And that is largely as a result of months and months and months of protests, not just at home, but on an international scale of solidarity. And I think that that's something that has been largely driven by ordinary working people at its core. And that is something that has allowed for a kind of political change to happen at government level. I'm not suggesting the Labour Party are perfect, but I do think that it would have been significantly more difficult to do that with the Conservatives. And I would argue if we had a Green government, or people like myself and other left-wing independents and socialists in government, it would have been significantly easier than it has been under the Labour government. So you see that the driving force is often from social movements and from communities, but quite often when it comes to getting things over the line, enacting laws, that kind of thing, it's about how much pressure social movements and communities need to put on politicians before they will, in my opinion, do the right thing. And that is likely going to be the same with the climate, because we are seeing reluctant politicians, reluctant governments still pushing back against the climate movement. And the climate movement have seen massive wins over the last few years. But if we had a more amenable government, a more socialist government, and a more ecologically aware government, I think that we would have made much more progress than we have at the moment. And I think that the two need to work in tandem.
Great, thank you, Niall. I think we can move on to one that's for Iris here from Malena, which is how do we make green movements more accessible to not only working class people, but migrants and POC? I am, for example, very often the only person from the Global South in a lot of these environments, and it seems like such a wasted opportunity. And perhaps Andya would like to speak to this as well.
Yeah, that's quite a complex question, and there are quite a few parts to it. I sympathize with this question. Often I am the only person of color in the room, even within the Green Party. I mean, we have wide decisions about this, but also in other activist spaces. For me, at least, I find it often relies on this kind of idea, I call it, and I don't know if there's a word for it, but the myth of the first. In the time, at least when I grew up, but often over the last probably 50 years, actually, especially here in Britain, there's this idea that things are just so much better than they used to be, and that we're constantly moving forwards and everything's already been done and everything's amazing. But as I've come into my adult life, and don't get me wrong, I faced a lot of racism when I was younger, but coming into my adult life, I consistently find myself being the first. The first person of color, or the first queer person to do something, or XYZ. For example, my role as vice president student support, I'm the 136th person to take the role as it's elected annually, and I'm the first Black person, right? That's insane to even comprehend in such an old institution. So what I find is often I go into these spaces and I expect there to be either be more people of color or more safeguards in which people of color and migrants are supported. And it's often not there. I, once again, am often maybe not the first, but the current person taking over that role. For me, I find it disappointing, and it is incredibly hard to deal with. But I also have to remind myself that I have just as much right to be in this room, to be sat at this table, that anyone else does, no matter how much melanin they have in their skin or where they are in the world. It is very hard, and I will admit that it's very hard not to give up in those situations. I feel and sympathize with you deeply, but what I do say is we have to continue fighting. We can't let ourselves be pushed out of these spaces. Even though it may feel like a waste of time or a waste of space, many of these people may be doing that on purpose. Now, that doesn't mean don't put yourself first, especially, I know you specifically said green movements and green parties. As Niall's already touched on, political parties are not the be-all and end-all towards a better world. there is so much more, and political parties tend to only be the slimmest part of that, where it is the social movements that often set the agenda and push the government to be in that space. So in respect to that, there is no simple answer, but what there is a drive for change and an appetite for a better future. Obviously, keep yourself safe, but make sure no one pushes you out of any single space that you belong in. Thank you.
And Iris, I see that Andya has added what seems to be hindering the access, if they may ask.
Now, I don't know specifically, and I'm aware at certain parts of in the UK Green movement and in social movement, this isn't reflected. However, it is reflected here in Scotland. What I find specifically related to what we spoke to earlier is that it's the same failures that are not bringing working class people in with them. So disproportionately, people of colour and migrants are more likely to be working class, but in doing so, not just being working class, those of them who were maybe middle class may be pushed out by the same cultural factors that is pushing the working class out of these movements. By making a slim definition, as I touched on in my opening remarks, about what makes an activist and what makes someone pushing for the better, greener world, what we're seeing is a movement which is essentially, in my opinion, locking people of colour out of it. Because if you do come as a person of colour who may have potentially different policy ideas or a different means to achieving something, often, like many working class voices are in these movements, you either become sidelined or you become burnt out as you are the only one in the room. This doesn't mean that this won't change. And through making these movements more collaborative, more accessible, and reframing, like I said, what it means to be an activist or working within these political movements, this can change, but it takes a concerted, direct effort from the movement itself, not from the people of colour who are being expected oftentimes to go into these movements and fix it for the people that are already there, to reach out, to build those bridges, and to make sure this movement is accessible. And as I'm sure many people on this call will know, it's not always that simple, and it's not always true. Things do change in time, but the burden should not ultimately be on us people of colour to go in and change it on our own. And I think that's the best I can say on that.
Thank you so much, Iris. Okay, moving on. The next question is, what relationship should political parties have with social movements, especially the climate movements? Communication across the left was mentioned, but what structures do we have for enabling the discussions needed? And then more specifically, what is the organizational form that we need to enable working class participation in politics? And this isn't directed at anyone in particular, so if either of the three of you feel comfortable responding.
I mean, I'm happy to answer. I think that to answer the last part of the question, Zoe, what is the organizational form that we need to enable the working class? I don't think I don't have a kind of perfect answer to that. I think that if we did, I'm fairly certain that it would get us in the right direction, but I don't really think that we've seen that so far yet. I do think that we've made some progress. I do think that things like community assemblies, citizens' assemblies are excellent examples of how that can work. That isn't just in Glasgow, but there are examples of that across the world, actually, making massive kind of improvements in terms of policy engagement. And I don't think that has to necessarily be on a kind of massive kind of national scale or citywide scale. That can be in communities themselves. And I think that that's something I would be very, very keen to explore when it comes to bringing more people into the green movement and environmental movement. I think that, even when we look at Scottish Green membership, largely they are focused around the more, younger elements of society. So maybe people who live in flats, people who live in rented accommodation. But I do think that bringing them into the fold is something we need to do. And I know you've said that you're a Scottish Green activist yourself. Thanks for coming along. It's great to see people here. But I do agree with another part of what you're saying about political education within the party, because I do think that quite often people get into politics with a few pet projects is the wrong phrase, but they maybe have one or two things that they're very, very passionate about, and that might be environmental politics, it might not. But I think wider class awareness and just a level of education that incorporates not just, you know, your own kind of passionate political projects, but also how they impact other parts of society. You know, how we can get to those goals, and maybe whether that should be a priority for the working class or not is something else we need to consider. So I too share some concerns about the lack of strategic thinking, not just by the Scottish Greens, but by the Green Movement largely. I think that you know, from a short-term perspective, I think that electoral success is a great thing, but I do think that it does have its limitations, and I think that bringing together the climate movement and you know, political parties who are sympathetic to that is something that we need to really work on. And I know that there are challenges, you know, a lot of climate movement organizations or charities, for example, and having too close relationships with political parties can make that very difficult. I do know that some people would argue that, you know, having people who are involved in the climate movement, but also in parties that are maybe less environmentally aware or maybe a little bit less progressive, also pulls them in the right direction. There's an argument for that, and I'm not going to tell someone that that's wrong, but there are different approaches. Personally, I would like to see, you know, trade unions have a massive role to play in that. I mentioned earlier on that I'm a passionate trade unionist. I actually work in the charity sector, and I see a lot of the best work done by non-profits and NGOs across Scotland and across the world is being done in that sector. And I think that tapping into people who are already aware of those issues, and largely those will be workers in that sector, and bringing them on side through trade unions, both formally and kind of informally, is something we can massively tap into. And I think that that's an opportunity for the Scottish Greens in particular. That probably wasn't a particularly straight answer, and I apologize for that, but I think that there isn't a perfect answer. But if someone else has one, I'm happy to be proved wrong.
Great. All right then. And I think we can move on to another question that's directed at Niall, but also says for or anyone involved in community organizing, which is, could you share examples of local environmental issues that resonate with working class communities and have the potential to lead to local activism and community building? So for Niall, but also for all.
I'm happy for somebody else to go first, because people have heard quite a lot from me, and I'm happy to add anything if I feel like that needs to happen, if that's okay.
Yeah, Iris, go ahead.
Yeah, so there are many, especially obviously I can only speak for the constituency in the local area that I live with, but there are many local issues. I mean, obviously the classical ones that you'll get will be bins and stuff, and the ultimately that is a climate issue as well, and the effect that has on the climate, as well as littering. Even again, these are the small climate issues, but obviously it's different in my constituency compared to areas, especially in the north. East of Scotland, sorry, I almost got my areas mixed up there, with areas that are very dependent on oil and gas, for example, who are basically being told by the consensus at the moment that the Green Movement wants to take their jobs away, that wants to take their jobs and ruin their communities, instead of actually giving the just transition that everyone else is pushing. Now that resonates really well. And so, like, really well, when you go out and speak to people, obviously something isn't going through, but if you speak to people and they say, oh, what are we going to do? And you say, oh, well, we've got this plan, this plan, this plan, and we're going to move them away from this. And actually, it's going to do better for the economy. It's going to do better for the businesses locally. It's going to bring all these prices down. And people are like, whoa, why have I never heard of this before? So there are so many interlinking areas of the climate movement and policies around mitigating the climate crisis, which are actually genuinely incredibly positive for working class. Now that's local up there. Here, like I already said, we have stuff such as bins, we have the low emission zone, which people are seeing, but we also have transitioning people away from using cars and stuff and towards more public transport. Now, when people first hear transitioning away from using cars, they think of the idea that they'll be trapped in their neighborhood and they won't be able to go anywhere, they won't be able to go to the shops. When you then explain to them about investing in local infrastructure, in having better buses, in having better trains, and better subways, and better whatever kind of local transport you have, once again, they're so energized and they're like, oh, I won't have to wait 2 or 3 hours to get to this area. And actually, I won't need to put this massive investment in getting a car and then getting a driving license and getting not oil, sorry, petrol and getting insurance, just so I can make, ultimately, for most people, according to the statistics, are quite short-term trips, which could be much easier made on public transport where everyone's doing. So again, like I said in my early speech, it's about reframing kind of what we're saying here as a movement. Not all of us, of course, but in the sense where it's like, actually, this will improve your lives. We're not saying we're going to come in and take. People, once you bring it as close to home, such as the just transition up in the northeast or down here in Glasgow, improving public transport, are suddenly so into it and thought, oh, well, I thought the Green Movement wanted to give more to the rich and wanted to do X, Y, Z and make it harder for me to live. As I already mentioned, I can't remember if it was an answer to a question or in my opening statement. This is because often we've unwittingly, through the failure of the left to kind of work with the working class, ceded many of these issues to this neoliberal consensus, where they have framed it, as they do with everything, as being something that the working class have to pay for. It doesn't have to be like that, but it does require us to use proper community building, as Niall has already said, as we're both involved in, and go out there and, like I said, meet people where they're at. Let's not lecture people. Let's not give them a big policy document and say this is going to save the planet. Let's tell them how this will affect their lives and how it will affect the planet as a whole.
Am I actually just to add quickly?
Go ahead.
I think just to add to what Iris has said, I'm not going to disagree with any of it. I think that an issue, Pierre, that I think not just in Scotland, but I think globally, people can organise around is housing. Largely, house building is an example of that. Would be something that I think working class people quite often are kind of second to when it comes to reacting to it. We see green movements and environmental movements quite often seen as NIMBYs, and I think for anyone that doesn't know that, that means not in my backyard. I think the idea that the environment needs to be protected at all costs, and that can quite often lead to particularly better off constituencies, and I don't mean that in the political sense, but I mean that in the demographic sense, having more of a say in where housing is built, what kind of housing is built, and the kind of impact that can have on house prices, both for buyers and for people who are looking to rent. And I think that can have a massive impact. I think if working class communities can organise around housing and have more of a say in where housing is built, what kind of housing is built. In Scotland, for example, I would much rather see some social housing and more affordable housing built. And I think that we aren't seeing enough of that, both from the Scottish government and the UK government. And I think that there will be, similar issues around the world. Organising in communities can be something that is a huge example. And just to kind of hark back to my experience as a journalist, one of the biggest examples of environmental story that went massively kind of viral in the local area in Barrhead was around a big housing project that was being tagged on to an existing scheme in Barrhead. That was on one of the poorest areas in the entire kind of local area, but the housing that was going to be built was all kind of large 4 or 5 bedroom luxury homes. None of it was affordable. There was no social element to it whatsoever. And actually, that is one of the most organised I've seen a local community become in a short space of time, all because 1 or 2 people were able to see the planning applications go in, organise around it at an early stage, and also say, okay, it's absolutely fine if you want to build houses here, but there's nothing for our community here. This is all going to be people coming from outside and benefiting from this, and we are going to see the increased traffic, the increased pollution, and a squeeze on utilities that we're already seeing. So how do we benefit from this? And that was one of the best examples of community organizing. That was back in 2017. That was a long time ago, and I think that those are issues that are still happening today, but I think there are huge opportunities in local communities, and I mean hyper local here on a street by street level that people can organize on. And I think that is there's some real empowerment that can happen as a result of that. So I think house building is a huge issue that we could see people organize around in the next few years.
Great, thank you, Niall. Okay, and now a question for Andya, which is revolving around the dominance of English and other European languages in sort of the discourse. So how can this be resisted at a grassroots level? So how can activists help to support the production and sharing of knowledge from the Global South to receive the visibility that it deserves when the knowledge that is being produced is expressed in a language that isn't English or a commonly spoken European language?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, great question. I like it. So, yeah, and I do agree that the politics of language is indeed like a big problem in the knowledge production. There are concepts, for example, that cannot be translated into the dominant language that we use. For instance, there's this word in the Filipino language called kapwa, a ka prefix in the word pwa, which is short for puwang. If you translate it in English, it would just mean others, which refers to other people's external to yourself. But in Filipino language, it means lives that occupies the same space as you, and therefore is like you. So those are the kind of meanings and nuances that are, I would say, be omitted in this kind of knowledge politics. So anyway, there are like methods that we can possibly use for this. It could be, for instance, photographs. One of my methods in my research is the use of photo voice, which features the photographs which would feature the photographs taken or images taken by the interlocutors. So the photographs would come from the perspectives of whoever is holding the camera based on how they see certain concept. And somehow it provides a way to navigate this, I would say, politics of languages and its capacity to obscure certain perspectives. And a more radical method that I would propose actually is perhaps activists from, say, other countries would have the willingness to learn non-dominant languages. I know, actually, I know someone who did this. He's a French scholar currently based in New Zealand, who actually learned the language of an indigenous community in the Philippines. And not only learned, but also acquired it. And acquiring such language would, I would say, bridge the seeming disconnect and would be a radical intervention in these kinds of knowledge making. It would help forward ways of knowing that may not have been previously considered in the dominant discourse and articulation that we have.
Amazing, thank you. All right, I think there's another one that got sent as a direct message to me, which I think is directed maybe at Niall, but I believe also maybe Iris, you could respond as well, which is a more around how are environmental journalists being treated in Scotland? Is it also a risky field of journalism? Or is it the other way around? Does it help hold people accountable and contribute to policy-making decisions?
So my understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected here, but I think there is a single environmental journalist, dedicated environmental journalist in Scotland. I think they work for the Scotsman. So it's a fairly small pool, unfortunately, and I think that that is part of the problem. That's not to say there aren't other people like myself who cover environmental issues. There are, but there in terms of specialism and dedication, there is only I believe one person who does it. So I think that that's a massive issue for a start. I wouldn't say that, particularly when you compare environmental journalists in Scotland and journalists in general in Scotland to the Global South, that there is any kind of comparison to the kind of danger that we're seeing here, because I do think that there is a lot more oversight over how journalism is funded here, and largely journalism in Scotland, when it comes to the environment and any kind of social issues, they are largely funded by big corporations. Newspapers are owned by, I think 95% of Scotland's media is owned by, a very, very select group of maybe 6 corporations across the country now. So, we are in a situation where the same companies and same corporations that in the global south would probably pose a fairly big risk to the personal safety of journalists, they are actually the employers in Scotland. So I think that we are in a slightly different position than people in the global south would be. But when it comes to how much time they have and how much security of job they have, you know, I think if you are a young journalist now and you were wanting to go into the profession, and you were wanting to make yourself a dedicated environmental journalist, the chances of you having a secure job at any point in the first 10 years of your career are slim to none. I'm 31 and I've been a working journalist for 8 years now. And it probably took me 3 or 4 years before it became even remotely acceptable to be able to pitch environmental stories, because they're not seen as sexy. They're not seen as something that will sell newspapers. And, you know, even The Guardian, which would largely be seen as the more progressive and liberal of the kind of large newspapers in the UK, and internationally, I suppose, The Guardian does very well online. The amount of times you'll see an environmental or green story on the front of The Guardian or The Observer is, you know, very, very, you know, you know, it's seldom at best. So I do really think it's worth underlining how few people are kind of covering this. You know, you're looking at 4 or 5 people across the entirety of a nation of 5 million people who are trying to hold large corporations to account. And I think that the bigger danger we face in Scotland is that people are just worn down and are driven out of the profession and are left with no choice but to maybe go and work for, you know, I covered politics, I covered local issues, and you know that often kind of transcended into environmental politics. But journalists in Scotland are paid terribly, and only now I work in a third sector job covering charities, you know, in a fairly kind of specialized magazine, am I in a position where I can comfortably pay my mortgage, pay my bills, and, you know, put food on the table on a regular basis. You know, that is something that I've worked. I was 6 or 7 years before I could get to that position, and to do so, I had to give up, you know, any kind of right to write about politics on a regular basis, write about the environment, and also kind of limit myself to a kind of specialized title. And I think that's one of the reasons I've kind of probably moved into the political, because I do think that I do have energy for that, and I think that there will be lots and lots of journalists who will be passionate about the environment, but they will be told to write about things like crime. And when I say crime, I don't mean environmental crime and, you know, the genuine ecocide that is going on. I think that if anyone walked into a newspaper and suggested that we write a story about that, they would probably be wrongly laughed out the room. So I think that there is a huge culture, or a really dismissive culture of anything when it comes to the environment here. But I do think that we we aren't in the same situation where people in the global south, who are some of the bravest journalists on the planet, you know, they effectively they are operating in war zones when they're reporting about the environment in the global south. You know, their personal safety is at risk every single day. And I think that there is a real shift in how we see things in Scotland, because even the environmental journalists that we do have, and we're talking about a very small group of people, most of them who are specialized in that area are still funded by the establishment. And, you know, the BBC doesn't even have an environment editor based in Scotland. I think that they have people who cover it down south. But even government funded media and state sponsored media doesn't have that level of expertise in Scotland. Channel 4 don't, ITV don't. You know, they maybe have somebody across the UK who looks at everything. But if you're looking at you know, for example, Iris talked about the just transition. You know, in Scotland, we want to move away from reliance on fossil fuels now, effectively, but we don't have anyone who understands that from the perspective of the environmental movement. We have people who are business reporters and business correspondents, dozens of them, literally dozens of business journalists in Scotland. We have people who are energy correspondents, but largely those are paid for by the oil and gas lobby in specialist websites. So even the issues of the environment for the next few years that should dominate the media landscape, all of the perspective on that is skewed and owned by the establishment and operated by the establishment. I think that there's not really a wide understanding of that, because I think a lot of reporting that goes on about oil and gas jobs and things like you know, corporation tax that could fund a just transition, all of that is done within the scope of these big businesses. And I think that that's something we really need to work on in Scotland and across the UK.
Thank you, Niall. All right, I think with that, we'll bring it to a close for this evening. So thank you.
Andya's just raised her hand.
Oh,
can you not see it?
yeah. No, I can't.
Oh,
Maybe just
sorry. All right. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add, since Niall mentioned about concepts like just transition, I just want to add that I think it is important, I think, to be critical about these concepts being forwarded in economy, for example, just transition, even sustainable or sustainable development or sustainability. Say, one of the proposed strategies in mitigating climate, for example, is the use of renewable resources as well. We can see, for example, the use of windmills in the global north in Europe, for instance, that can say provide more efficient energy, clean energy, etc., etc. But what we don't see is that the materials where the windmills are came from the global south, the lithium, the cobalt, iron ores, rare earths, and most of those materials are extracted from lands owned by indigenous communities, for example, and using the labor of workers who are poorly paid on a day-to-day basis. So there's this transport of materials, there's this exploitation of the workers, and even the use of those labor to excavate and even displace the indigenous communities from their ancestral homes. So yeah, there's this, I would say, politics that needs to be arrested or critically investigated in forwarding these kinds of concepts. And I think it is important to surface this in the discourse. Yeah.
All right then. Okay. And this time, Emma, are there any other hands coming up on your side of things?
No other hands. No.
Okay, no. All right then. With that, I think we'll bring it to a close. I wanted to thank our speakers for spending their time with us this evening, and also thank you everyone for bringing yourselves to this Monday evening with us, so we could have this very important conversation. And I invite you all to stay in touch and follow our social media and sign up to our newsletter and emails to stay in touch and see what we come up with next for our upcoming events and panels from the Working Class Climate Alliance. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time.